In the late 1800s, John D. Rockefeller perceived that oil was the fuel of the future and made a fortune filling America's growing demand for it. A 100 years later, automobiles had become a way of life for Americans. Driving a car, preferably a big car, had become a part of the American dream. Americans didn't worry about where the oil came from, as long as it was cheap and plentiful.
The energy crisis has developed into a money crisis. The worst is yet to come.
More than a third of the oil consumed in the United States was imported. In the 1970s, when oil exporting countries engineered a series of oil shortages, Americans were held hostage by high prices and high consumption habits.
I had to go up Standing Rock for a meeting, and when I pulled in my gas station, I said, "Could you just get me enough so I can get to the airport and back?" Oh my gosh, I don't have any gas. You better just go home. I mean, literally. So I had to go home and call him and say, "I can't even make it to the airport." So, you know, boom, we realized things were in a lot of trouble.
I remember waiting in long lines for gas, but not really understanding why the shortage of gas and why we had to go through this, knowing that it had something to do with the Middle East. I was inconvenienced more than anything else. I just wasn't able to analyze it at that time as to why the dependence on oil and how that was going to lead to worse things for us as a country.
It was oil that ran the engine of the American economy, and its scarcity provoked an economic crisis.
The economy bogged down in the 1970s because oil is such a key input to so many things in the U.S. economy. And we had two different oil shocks, both caused by the OPEC cartel. As they were able to raise prices, there was a significant increase in input costs throughout all of the U.S. society. And that increase is what really led to a stagnation in the economy.
President Jimmy Carter believed the energy crisis required Americans to change their consumption habits, but his message of conservation and sacrifice was unpopular with the American public.
Our decision about energy will test the character of the American people and the ability of the President and the Congress to govern this nation.
I think people still had reasonable expectations that the government would be a driver in their economic prosperity. They really weren't clear what private sector solutions might be. And there was a sense, I think, in part of the late 70s of panic. When you looked at the hostages that were being held, our sense of our national preeminence being challenged, and how that fit into the economic picture, the major inflation and the lack of growth, you had a situation of national frustration.
Time to reawaken this industrial giant, to get government back within its means, and to lighten our punitive tax burden.
When Ronald Reagan promised a pain-free recovery, American voters sent Reagan to Washington and Carter home to Georgia. Reagan's solution was supply-side economics, also known as trickle-down.
Trickle-down economics suggests that if you give a bonus to people at the top, they'll trickle it down to folks at the bottom. So in other words, if I cut corporate taxes, corporations will invest in machinery, which will then cause them to hire more people because someone has to work the machinery.
If you're making the wealthy better off, that's going to increase investment, maybe generate more new businesses. And with those new businesses and the additional investment, it will move down in terms of creating more jobs and higher salaries for people within the economy.
It's a leap of faith. If you work on the supply side, you invest on the supply side, then things will happen on the demand side.
Reagan's supply-side theories were similar to those that had been in vogue during the 20s, prior to the Great Depression. They contradicted the Keynesian theories of the New Deal.
The big thing in Keynesian economics was to move the focus away from the supply side to the demand side. The reason that we saw a lot of the New Deal programs was just getting income in people's pockets. If they started to have jobs and got income, then they would spend it. Whether they were buying groceries or they were buying clothes, all of these are going to create jobs. And if businesses are actually seeing some spending, then they can hire some more workers in order to take care of those customers.
The bubble up, New Deal kind of economics created all kinds of economic drivers for people at the bottom that had never existed. So the poor were empowered. People of color were empowered. I think there was a real resistance and almost a pushback on some of that. When you think about it, how do you shift from bubbling up to trickling down? And I think part of that is about you don't like what bubbles up, but you can control what trickles down.
We think the time has come where there has to be a change of direction.
A cornerstone of Reaganomics was the Laffer curve.
The Laffer curve exhibited a relationship between income tax rates and income tax revenue, and essentially said that during the early period, if you raise tax rates, you raise revenue, but we get beyond a point where if tax rates are higher than that, tax revenue will actually go down. If you were above that point, you could actually lower tax rates and increase tax revenue. And from a politician standpoint, cutting taxes and being able to spend more is ideal. Normally, to keep a balanced budget, if you cut taxes, you have to cut spending at the same time. But believing that through the Laffer curve, you could cut taxes without cutting spending, we essentially created a bigger deficit during that time period. So we were spending our way out of a recession.
There are more poor than ever, more families in trouble, more and more people who need help but can't find it.
In this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem.
Reagan believed that business was overburdened with taxation and government regulation, and that the forces of capitalism should be unleashed to operate in a free market.
We're a very different company today than we were 5 years ago.
On the positive side, deregulation does cut down the cost of doing business. The thing that we find on the other side, though, is that deregulation increases competition and removes some of the safety nets that come from regulation.
Now I gotta cut loose, put loose, kick off the Sunday shoes.
I consider the Watt-Lujan bill to be the negation of the concept of wilderness protection.
Deregulation allowed for greater competition and often led to lower prices, but provided less federal supervision, including less protection of natural resources. In the marketplace, the removal of constraints on business led to a free-for-all atmosphere of corporate mergers, hostile takeovers, and financial schemes that made millionaires overnight. By the late 1980s, many of the stories of financial success had turned to corruption and scandal.
What's extraordinary is what these crooks and high rollers have been doing and why the regulators have let them get away with it.
About a third of the nation's savings and loans are on the verge of collapse.
The deregulation of the savings and loan industry had given small banks the freedom to gamble with depositors' funds and led to the biggest scandal of them all.
The savings and loan debacle of the 1980s is at least partially a function of governments stepping back from its regulatory role in banking. Federal government reduced the oversight in terms of the kind of loans that were granted. And then when these loans began to be called, people didn't have the money. We ended up with investors, seniors, pensioners, who lost their life savings because of this. It really raises questions about why we need regulation for capitalism. Capitalism is not a system that works smoothly, reasonably, and fairly without oversight.
New Deal protections helped to protect depositors and avert a more serious financial crisis. But American taxpayers ultimately paid the price. The results of Reaganomics were a mixed bag. The rich got richer, the poor got poorer. The economy expanded, as did the national debt.
We were able to get out of the recession, and we had an extended period of economic growth but we were financing a lot of that through deficit spending. Running deficits to try to pull an economy out of a recession was not something that was unheard of. But the thing that we saw all through the 80s and 90s was that we continued to run the budget deficit during the expansionary periods. And so we added a substantial amount to the debt that existed.
Read my lips. No new passes.
I think all Republican administrations are going to lean more toward the tax cuts than they are additional government spending. We're trying to stimulate the economy. That kind of came out of Reagan and has continued through most of the Republican administrations that have followed him.
Welcome to the working week. Oh, I know it don't thrill you. I hope it don't kill you. Welcome to the working week. You gotta do it till you do it, so you better get to it.
By the mid-20th century, organized labor had become a powerful force in the United States economy, and union membership had made life better for millions of industrial workers. But organized labor had also come under fire from some sectors, charged with abusing its power to make excessive demands.
I think that there is an important place for unions in our society. I think that if they're operating properly, they are protecting people's rights and their livelihoods. Not that I always feel that the unions of today are the same as the unions of my grandfather's time. I've had my differences with unions and protectionism and keeping people employed at all costs as opposed to only when they're doing the right thing.
RS-2C24, TAC 9.
Beginning in the first year of the Reagan administration, 1981, public policy does a complete turn. The Republicans that Ronald Reagan is leading are committed to a different sense of government's role. And they see the labor movement as an impediment to economic growth.
In 1981, conflict erupted when PATCO, the Professional Air Traffic Controllers Association, went on strike. President Reagan was faced with a national transportation crisis and an opportunity to send a message to organized labor in the United States.
They are in violation of the law, and if they do not report for work within 48 hours, they have forfeited their jobs and will be terminated.
I remember feeling very strongly that the government should not be stepping in so soon, and that it was done symbolically as a gesture to break the strength of the union. You're looking at people who are called upon to do an unbelievable job, literally juggling human lives up in the air and keeping everybody on track and keeping everyone safe. I'm amazed that the stress and the information load that those people are subject to, that they're able to perform that job. And that said, in relationship to the work that I do in public safety communications, where the same difficulties exist, same stressors exist.
Reagan chose to fire all of them and make that firing stick. And he did that because he did, in fact, represent a new form of conservatism, which was not going to try to negotiate or cut a deal.
There's just an anti-union attitude with this administration. There's no doubt about that.
They were never rehired, and this sent a chilling message to the rest of the trade union movement, and a message also to management that a new season was upon us.
During the 1980s, corporations began restructuring on a massive scale, driven by deregulation, deunionization, and free trade policies that open up foreign markets. Competition in the global marketplace impelled companies to reduce the cost of labor by downsizing, outsourcing, layoffs, or plant relocation.
The spreading of what had been once American industrial jobs around the world is really something that began in a substantial way in the late 1970s and throughout the 1980s. And it's a response to this really very dramatic economic crisis that hits the United States in the 1970s. And that crisis created a very big profit crunch for corporate America. Profits tumbled in the late 1970s. And what they sought were various ways in which to boost their profits back up. And one way of doing that is finding lower wage bills. And so if you can move production to places where wages are lower, your profits go up, and an awful lot of corporations did that. The effect of that for communities across the United States has been devastating. If you go into old industrial centers, what you see is economic devastation, because the jobs that once sustained communities like that are no longer in the United States.
Every one of you is going to have to change jobs about 8 times in a lifetime, even if you keep working for the same company. Nobody can promise you anything else. So all we can do for you is to make it possible for you to seize your own destiny.
Technological developments, especially computer technology, also brought about major changes in the economy. Mechanization reduced the number of manufacturing jobs, while computerization created new jobs in information processing and technology. But these jobs required education and skills that many factory workers did not have.
Now you have an economy that is defined by 2 different sectors that exist side by side, but in terms of people's daily experiences are dramatically different. A service economy of low-wage work and a high-end economy dominated by finance, dominated by engineering, dominated by information technology.
For millions of women entering the job market in the 1980s, service sector jobs provided employment, but offered limited opportunities for income and advancement.
Prior to 1970, most women worked in typically female jobs. If they were professional, they were teachers, nurses, and social workers. If they were pink or blue collar, they were secretaries, they worked in light manufacturing. That profile did not substantially change, but you began to see more women in the professions.
Although the wage gap was closing, women still only earned about 3/4 of what men earned.
The wage gap is less among younger workers, particularly men and women coming out of college. The wage gap grows as workers age, and particularly as families are formed. And again, the problem is caring labor and how you combine those household responsibilities with market work. One of the interesting transformations in the world of work is that work is becoming more flexible. There's more part-time jobs, there's more temporary jobs, but oftentimes flexibility is primarily flexibility for employers, not for employees. So many blue-collar jobs that were once full-time, long-term jobs have been transformed so that they're contingent jobs, and people do not have job security, they're not given any benefits, and that's a problem.
Between 1973 and 2000, the income of the top 1% of Americans rose by 148%, while the average real income of the bottom 90% of American taxpayers actually fell by 7%. Many full-time workers were not earning enough income to rise above the poverty level. According to an article Business Week published in 2003, Americans were far less likely to rise above the economic class into which they were born.
The person that, maybe dropped out of high school and made a name for themselves and, pulled themselves up by their bootstraps, as, went with the story, that's getting more and more difficult because in this information society, the level of technology that you're going to be working with is constantly rising, and so the education that you need in order to work in that economy is rising. The U.S. economy has moved through a number of waves in the service sector. The service economy started all the way back at the turn of the century with the big stores. Then we moved into government services. In the 60s and 70s, we started to see financial services. In the 80s and particularly 90s, information technology took off. So in many ways, the new economy was what people talk about as the information economy. It's still a service economy, but it's sort of the growth of the new sector of the service economy. One of the things about that new information economy is that we were starting to see the results of a lot of investment that took place during the 80s and into the early 90s. If we think to our own experiences, when you bought your first computer, it was a long time before you really figured out how to use it in a really productive way. And my guess is most of us were probably on our second or third computer before we really started to say, man, this really helps a lot from a work standpoint.
But our operating costs are up.
Well, businesses are very similar to that. So a lot of the investment that was going on during the 80s didn't really show up in terms of increased productivity until the 90s.
The internet is sort of the brave new world. We started out with our website, and it was very new, and we were trying to develop a website so that if you wanted to find out about Biltmore and then later find out about Asheville in Western North Carolina and Biltmore, you could come to our website and we would show you all we could to try to talk you into coming up here for the weekend. We started counting individual uses, and we get 20,000, and we couldn't believe it. Well, this past Christmas, 350,000 people a month are coming to our website, and they're getting information on Biltmore State. It's so amazing, and so what do we do with that? And then we're still trying to figure that out.
The new promise of the global economy, the information age, unimagined new work, life-enhancing technology, all these are ours to seize.
An entirely new economic sector was created when the internet went public.
A lot of new investors came into the market during the 90s, people that historically would have never gotten involved in the stock market.
High-tech stocks, particularly those of internet startup companies, were traded at startlingly inflated prices.
The crazy thing about the dot-com in many parts is that people were buying stock in firms that under normal circumstances didn't have the financials that you would look for in a stock that you would normally purchase. Firms that were extremely hot in the dot-com sector had no earnings, and in many cases didn't project any earnings for, in some cases, as many as 3 to 5 years. So people were treating the dot-com stocks totally different than they would treat any other stocks.
In early 2000, high-tech stocks began to slip, and by late 2000, the bubble had burst. Investors lost millions, while many dot-com employees who had accepted stock options in lieu of higher salaries lost everything, including their jobs. When the dot-com bubble burst, many unprofitable companies were sunk, but the high-tech industry was here to stay. At the end of the 20th century, the nation was suffering from a financial hangover. The dot-com bubble had burst and the bull market ended. Many people had lost their life savings, while layoffs left millions of others unemployed. Tales of corruption and financial misdoing were again leaking out. Energy shortages brought on financial crisis in the West and blackouts in the East.
I am proposing that all the income tax reductions set for 2004 and 2006 be made permanent.
As the nation lurched into recession, a new administration proposed to stimulate the economy through deregulation, tax cuts for the wealthy, and increased military spending. The new economy was beginning to look a lot like the old economy.
Since the 80s, certainly, social policy, politics has moved in a more conservative direction, looking to the market alone to solve the problems that Americans have. This was a perspective rejected in 1932 and 1933. We've moved back to that in part because those who own companies, employers, have gained political and social and sort of cultural power. Many, many elements of what we thought of as absolutely bedrock New Deal ideas, whether it's minimum wages or Social Security or health and safety protections, those have been eroded in the last 20 years.
We have the lowest percentage of our workforce unionized of any industrial country in the world. And it's going to stay poor until public policy changes. Why are unions important? Because ordinary working people deserve to know that at the end of the week, at the end of the month, there's going to be enough money in their bank accounts to pay the rent, to put food on the table. They need to know that when they retire, they're not going to face 20 years of deprivation. So that if they lose their jobs, or if they're hurt on the job, they're not going to lose everything. That's not a lot to ask. Only public policy can make that happen.
I have come to speak to you tonight about our economic recovery program.
We can use policy any way that we want to. We can use it to distribute the fruits of our economy, of our very vibrant economy, more equally, or we can decide that we want power to be concentrated. While I understand people's concern about the efficient and appropriate use of their dollars from a taxation perspective, I think that people also need to ask themselves, what do they get from taxes? I want to hear the balancing conversation about the benefits of taxation.
I don't think we're ever going to see a time where there's no role for the government in the economy. In fact, one of the things that's been going on in the last 20 years is trying to find that ideal mix. Everybody's trying to find that ideal mix, and we still don't know what's perfect.